Hello viewers, today's session is all about Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. It is one of the best novels of 20th century. It is a novel by the Hungarian-born British novelist Arthur Koestler. It is his best-known work, which was first published in 1940. A man named Rubashov is in prison. He has served the revolution in Russia all his life and now has been locked up for supporting the opposition. Throughout his stay in prison, he recalls past experiences and actions. Ivanov and Gletkin are the men in charge of making Rubashov confess his crimes. They use drastic measures to force him to do this. Throughout these experiences, Rubashov contemplates how he should act. In the end, he decides to confess and accept the consequences. The consequence is death, and that is how the novel ends. In 1998, the Modern Library ranked Darkness at Noon as 8th on its list of 100 best English language novels of the 20th century. Arthur Koestler was born in Budapest in Hungary in 1905, educated in Vienna. He immersed himself in the major ideological and social conflicts of his time. From 1932 to 1938, he was a member of the German Communist Party, but left the party during the Moscow trials. A communist during the 1930s and visitor for a time in the Soviet Union, he became disillusioned with the party and left it in 1938. Later that year in Spain, he was captured by the fascist forces under Franco and sentenced to death. Released through the last-minute intervention of the British government, he went to France where the following year, he was again arrested for his political views. Released in 1940, he went to England, where he made his home. This period he depicted in Spanish Testament in the year 1937. He is best known for his novel Darkness at Noon, written in 1940, which reflects his break with the Communist Party and his ideological rebirth. Koestler's first book in English, Scum of the Earth, an autobiography, came out in 1941. His first novel was The Gladiators. He has written it as Dialogue with Death in the year 1942. His novels, reportage, autobiographical works, and political and cultural writings established him as an important commentator on the dilemmas of the 20th century. He died in 1983. Koestler made his international breakthrough as a writer with Darkness at Noon, which revealed the totalitarian system and the decay of the Russian Revolution. Based partly on the writer's own experiences as prisoner and on Stalin's trials, the book depicted the fate of an old idealistic Bolshevik Rubashov, a victim of Stalin's rule of terror. Rubashov is imprisoned in 1938 and persuaded to confess crimes against the state, of which he is innocent. In his own mind, Rubashov knows he is guilty of working for a system that has caused too much suffering. Darkness at Noon is considered one of the most powerful political works of the century. Koestler's other works about Stalinism and communism include The Yogi and the Commissar in 1945, The God That Failed in 1949. In his memoirs, Arrow in the Blue in 1951 and The Invisible Writing in 1954, Koestler analyzed his quest for utopia and his disillusionment with Russian communism. From the 1950s, Koestler published scientific and philosophical works. The Sleepwalkers, A History of Man's Changing Vision of the Universe in 1959, a best-selling history of early astronomy, prompted by Smithsonian Professor of Astronomy and History of Science, Owen Gingerich, to prove wrong Koestler's claim that Copernicus' The Revolutionary Bus in 1543 was a book that nobody read, an all-time worst seller. Gingerich recorded his decades-long odyssey from library to library in the engaging bibliophilic detective story The Book Nobody Read in the year 2004, concluding that Koestler could not have been more mistaken. Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon is one of the 20th century's most famous political novels or fictional accounts of a historical reality. Written by a former member of Communist Party, it is a unique glimpse into the volatile political situation under the government of Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR in the late 1930s. Its main character, Rubeshov, combines the characteristics of key Soviet politicians and intellectual leaders from the Bolshevik Revolution, and the story of his imprisonment and confession explains and develops the topical political themes of totalitarianism, socialism, communism, and individualism. Part of the reason for the novel's wide success is the fact that Koestler, who was influenced by Sigmund Freud, was able to weave his political and philosophical themes into a compelling psychological narrative. With the use of rationalistic argument and religious symbolism, Koestler is able to consider politics together with psychology and individualism. Despite the loss of the origin German text, Daphne Harry's English translation of the novel, published in London in 1940, has become an international classic and has profoundly affected how history remembers the Moscow show trials. The background of Darkness at Noon. Koestler wrote Darkness at Noon as the second part of a trilogy. The first volume was The Gladiators in 1939, first published in Hungarian. It was a novel about the subversion of the Spartacus revolt. The third novel was Arrival and Departure in 1943, about a refugee during World War II. By then, living in London, Koestler wrote that novel in English. Of these two, The Gladiators has had much sales success. Koestler wrote Darkness at Noon in German while living in Paris. His companion, the sculptor Daphne Hardy, translated it into English during early 1940 while she was living with him in Paris. The German text was lost as Koestler and Hardy escaped Paris separately in May 1940, just before the German army occupation after its defeat of the French. On reaching England, Hardy began arranging to have the manuscript published. Koestler joined the French Foreign Legion, deserted in North Africa, and eventually made his way to Portugal. Waiting in Lisbon for passage to England, Koestler heard a false report that the ship taking Hardy to England had been torpedoed and all persons lost, along with his only manuscript. He attempted suicide. He wrote about this incident in Scum of the Earth in 1941, his memoir of that period. Koestler finally arrived in London and the book was published there in early 1941. Darkness at Noon is an allegory set in the USSR, not named, during 1938 purges as Stalin consolidated his dictatorship by eliminating potential rivals within the Communist Party, the military and the professions. None of this is identified explicitly in the book. Most of the novel occurs in unnamed prison and in the recollections of the main character Rubashov. Koestler drew on his experience of being imprisoned by Francisco Franco's officials during the Spanish Civil War, which he described in his memoir Dialogue with Death. He was kept in solitary confinement and expected to be executed. He was permitted to walk in the courtyard in the company of other prisoners. While not beaten, he believed that other prisoners were. The plot summary and structure. Darkness at Noon is divided into 4 parts. The first hearing, the second hearing, the third hearing and the grammatical fiction. The first hearing. The novel begins with Rubashov's arrest in the middle of the night by 2 men from the secret police in the USSR. It was called the NKVD. When they came for Rubashov, they woke him up from a dream in which he was being arrested by the Gestapo. One of the men is about Rubashov's age, the other is somewhat younger. The older man is formal and courteous, the younger is brutal. The difference between them introduces the first major theme of Darkness at Noon, the passing of the older civilized generation and the barbarism of their successors. Imprisoned, Rubashov is at first relieved to be finished with the anxiety of dread during mass arrests. He is expecting to be kept in solitary confinement until he is shot. He begins to communicate with number 402, the man in the adjacent cell, by using a tap code. Rubashov quickly realizes that they don't have much to discuss. Unlike Rubashov, number 402 is not an intellectual. He just wants to hear the details of Rubashov's latest sexual encounter. Rubashov humors him for a time, but it is too embarrassed to continue. He thinks of the old Bolsheviks, number 1, and the Marxist interpretation of history. Throughout the novel, Rubashov, Ivanov and Glitkin speculate about the historical processes and how individuals and groups are affected by them. Each hopes that no matter how vile his actions may seem to their contemporaries, history will eventually absolve them. This is the faith that makes the abuses of the regime tolerable, as the men consider the suffering of a few thousand or a few million people against the happiness of future generations. They believe that gaining the socialist utopia, which they believe is possible, will cause the imposed suffering to be forgiven. Since joining the party as a teenager, Rubashov has officered soldiers in the field, won a commendation for fearlessness, repeatedly volunteered for hazardous assignments, endured torture, betrayed other communists who deviated from the party line, and proven that he is loyal to its policies and goals. Recently, he has had doubts. Despite 20 years of power in which the government caused the deliberate deaths and execution of millions, the party does not seem to be any closer to achieving the goal of a socialist utopia. That vision seems to be receding. Rubashov is in a quandary between a lifetime of devotion to the party and his conscience and the increasing evidence of his own experience on the other. From this point, the narrative switches back and forth between his current life as a political prisoner and his past life as one of the party elite. He recalls his first visit to Berlin about 1933 after Hitler gained power. Rubishev was to purge and reorganize German communists. He met with Richard, a young communist cell leader who had distributed material contrary to the party line. In a museum underneath a picture of the Pieta, Rubishev explains to Richard that he has violated party discipline, become objectively harmful and must be expelled from the party. A Gestapo man hovers in the background with his girlfriend on his arm. Too late, Richard realizes that Rubishev has betrayed him to the secret police. He begs Rubishev not to throw him into the wolves, but Rubishev leaves him quickly. Getting into a taxicab, he realizes that the taxicab driver is also a communist. The taxicab driver offers to give him free fare, but Rubishev pays the fare. As he travels by train, he dreams that Richard and the taxicab driver are trying to run him over with a train. This scene introduces the second and third major themes of Darkness at Noon. The second, suggested repeatedly by the Pieta and other Christian imagery, is the contrast between the brutality and modernity of communism on one hand and gentleness, simplicity and tradition of Christianity. Although Koestler is not suggesting a return to Christian faith, he implies that communism is the worst of the two alternatives. The third theme is the contrast between the trust of the rank and file communists and the ruthlessness of the party elite. The rank and the file trust and admire men like Rubishev, but the elite betrays and uses them with little thought. As Rubishev confronts the immortality of his actions as a party chief, his obsessed tooth begins to bother him, sometimes reducing him to immobility. Rubishev recalls being arrested soon after by the Gestapo and imprisoned for 2 years. Although repeatedly tortured, he never breaks down. After the Nazis finally release him, he returns to his country to receive a hero's welcome. Number 1's increasing power makes him uncomfortable, but he does not act in opposition. He requests a foreign assignment. Number 1 is suspicious, but grants the request. Rubishev is sent to Belgium to enforce party discipline among the dock workers. After the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the League of Nations and the party condemned Italy and imposed an international embargo on strategic resources, especially oil, which the Italians needed. The Belgian dock workers are determined not to allow any shipments for Italy to pass through their port. As his government intends to supply the Italians with oil and other resources, secretly, Rubishev must convince the dock workers that, despite the official policy, as communists, they must unload the materials and send them to the Italians. Their cell leader, a German communist immigrant nicknamed Little Lowe, tells Rubishev his life's story. He is a communist who has sacrificed much for the party and is still completely dedicated. When all the workers have gathered, Rubishev explains the situation. They react with disgust and refuse to follow his restrictions. Several days later, party publications denounce the entire cell by name, virtually guaranteeing arrest by the Belgian authorities who were trying to suppress communism. Little Louis hangs himself. Rubishov then begins a new assignment. In the novel, after a week in prison, he is brought in for the first examination or hearing, which is conducted by Ivanov, an old friend. Also a veteran of the Civil War, he is an old Bolshevik who shares Rubishov's opinion of the revolution. Rubishov had then convinced Ivanov not to commit suicide after his leg was amputated due to war wounds. Ivanov says that if he can persuade Rubishov to confess to the charges, he will have repaid his debt. With confession, Rubishov can lessen his sentence to 5 or 10 years in a labor camp instead of execution. He simply has to cooperate. The charges are hardly discussed as both men understand they are not relevant. Rubishov says he is tired and does not want to play this kind of game anymore. Ivanov sends him back to cell, asking him to think about it. Ivanov implies that Rubishov can perhaps live to see the socialist utopia they have both worked so hard to create. The second hearing. The next session of the book begins with an entry in Rubishov's diary. He struggles to find his place and that of the other old Bolsheviks within the Marxist interpretation of history. Ivanov and a junior examiner, Gletkin, discuss Rubishov's fate in the prison canteen. Gletkin urges using harsh physical methods to demoralize the prisoner and force his confession, while Ivanov insists that Rubishov will confess after realizing it is the only logical thing to do given his situation. Gletkin recalls that during the collectivization of the peasants, they could not be persuaded to surrender their individual crops until they were tortured and killed. Since that helped enable the ultimate goal of a socialist utopia, it was both the logical and a virtuous thing to do. Ivanov is disgusted but cannot refute Gletkin's reasoning. Ivanov believes in taking harsh actions to achieve the goal, but he is troubled by the suffering he causes. Gletkin says the older man must not believe in the coming utopia. He characterizes Ivanov as a cynic and claims to be an idealist. Their conversation continues the theme of the new generation taking power over the old. Ivanov is portrayed as intellectual, ironical and at bottom humane, while Gletkin is unsophisticated, straightforward and unconcerned with others' suffering. Ivanov has not been convinced by the younger man's arguments. Rubishov continues in solitary confinement. The third and fourth hearing. Taking over the interrogation of Rubishov, Gletkin uses physical abuses such as sleep deprivation and forcing Rubishov to sit under a glaring lamp for hours on end to wear him down. Rubishov finally capitulates. As he confesses to the false charges, Rubishov thinks of the many times he betrayed agents in the past. Richard the young German, little Louis in Belgium and Arlova his secretary mistress. He recognizes that he is being treated with the same ruthlessness. His commitment to following his logic to its final conclusion and his own lingering dedication to the party cause him to confess fully and publicly. The climax of the novel occurs when Rubishov finally gives in to last of the points of his confession. He is finally defeated and now awaits his coming execution. He just wants to sleep and not worry about anything. Gletkin has won and Rubishov has accepted his defeat. The novel ends with Rubashev's execution. About Rubashev. The main character is Nicholas Salmanovich Rubashev, a man in his 50s, based on a number of men who were the victims of the so-called Moscow trials, several of whom were personally known to the author. Rubashev is a stand-in for the old Bolsheviks as a group, and Koestler uses him to explore their actions at the 1938 Moscow show trials. Arlova, a heavy, shapely woman with a sleepy voice. Arlova is Rubashev's secretary during his job at the trade delegation. They have an affair, and Arlova tells Rubashev that you will always be able to do what you like with me. Before the Stalinist purges begin, and she receives a warning in her new post as librarian to restock the books of opposition leaders. Shortly afterwards, Rubashev stops his little jokes with her, and she stops going to his room. Soon, she is condemned as a traitor and sentenced to death. Political philosophy. Darkness at Noon is concerned with some of the most important controversies in 20th century political thought. In addition to a topical exploration of the political theory behind the Communist Party in Moscow, the novel engages in a wider debate on morality, justice, and philosophy in modern political systems. It considers the fundamental elements of revolutionary ideology and social morality, using a particular political atrocity to evaluate the set of values at its core. Point of view, third person. Rubashev is the obvious protagonist of the novel. The story revolves around him and his experiences in prison. Gletkin fulfills the role of antagonist in the novel. He is the force opposing Rubashev in prison. He wants Rubashev to confess and will stop at nothing to make him do it. There are also many secondary characters such as Ivanov, number 402, Arlova, Hairlip, and number 1. These characters help to move the story along during the lapses between Rubashev's thoughts. The style. In order to convincingly evaluate the communist emphasis on the furthest extent of rationality and the objective compulsion to action, Koestler employs the stylistic device of extremely thorough rational thinking. In other words, he uses the party's own game in order to attack its policy. Rubashev is such an effective voice for the argument of the novel because he follows rationality to its extreme, finds it to be absurd, and is left only with the irrational grammatical fiction. I hope all the viewers have enjoyed this session of the novel named Darkness at Noon. We have seen how Rubashev has gone through the troublesome life in the prison and his experiences are dealt forth. Thank you.